Hi, everybody. When we get up into Chapter 28 about World War II, it's important to note that Hitler's overall aim for this war was what is on page 712 called Lebensraum. Lebensraum, living space. The idea that Germany was the superior race, and since Germany was such a relatively overpopulated country with very little natural resources, that Germany deserved living space, take it away from inferior races and so forth. So this was, from the beginning, a racial war, an ideological war. Hitler wanted to, first of all, of course, get a foothold in Eastern Europe. In 1938, the Western nations were so determined not to go to war, were so isolationist, that England and France get together and decide to basically give Hitler Czechoslovakia, the German-speaking portion there of Czechoslovakia, the Sudetenland. So they get together and bargain with Hitler and give him Czechoslovakia. In 1939, when Hitler decides to make the same demand of Poland, in this case, England refuses to go along with this. And when the German army invades Poland in 1939, England and France declare war on Germany. It's important to note, of course, that this had been coming for a long time. The League of Nations had failed in its effort to keep the peace, keep the balance of peace. Germany had rearmed as early as 1935 and announced that, and had left the League of Nations soon afterward. Italy, Germany's fascist ally, had attacked Ethiopia in 1936. Hitler had remilitarized the Rhineland and had sent troops in, along with Italy, to help the fascists, or the semi-fascists, in the Spanish Civil War against the government. So, right away, Hitler's efforts to get what he wanted was very successful. He carries out the Anschluss, or the annexation of Austria, in 1938. And then, of course, in September the 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland with its blitzkrieg strategy. The blitzkrieg was really necessitated because the Germans weren't ready for war. So they had to carry on this blitzkrieg, or lightning war, to get a hold of Poland, because they were so undermanned and under-equipped and not really ready for war at all. But the early successes of the Nazi effort in World War II were pretty astounding. In 1940, in just a few months' space, Hitler had overran France, he had overran the Netherlands, Belgium, had overran, most of Western Europe, in fact, and almost trapped the British Army at Dunkirk. The British and the remainder of the Free French Army had to actually be evacuated by a series of civilian boats and military ships and so forth. So Hitler's successes were astounding. His only problem was that he could not get Britain to submit, and he was hesitant to carry out a land invasion of England, so he decides to carry out an air war called the Battle of Britain in 1940 to try to bomb England into submission. That doesn't go very well. Hitler wants to desperately put England out of the war because he's already got France out, and he is determined to carry out his racial policy in the East by attacking the Soviet Union, which he finally does in 1941 because he can't hold off any longer. Hitler had signed this non-aggression pact with Stalin. Both sides knew it was meaningless, but both sides needed a little space to get ready for war. So, officially at least, for almost 2 years, the Soviet Union and Germans were allies, but of course very uncomfortable allies. So, Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, was launched on June 22nd, 1941. Almost succeeded. The Nazi armies got up into within binocular sighting distance of Moscow before the Soviets were actually able to mount a proper defensive. And the war was on, the big wars in Leningrad, Stalingrad. The Soviet Union really fought hardest and lost the most people in World War II, and they also did the most to defeat the Germans, because until Stalingrad in 1942, 1943, Hitler had overran everybody he had ever attacked. So really, the Nazi war is lost in the Soviet Union. It's important also, of course, that the race war was carried out there, the first ethnic cleansings of Jews, the experiments with the shooting squads, and later with the gas vans, and finally the construction of the concentration camps in Poland, the concentration camps, the death camps in the center, where they would work some Jews and prisoners of war to death and actually kill others right away with the poison gas. A terrible, terrible thing that happened there. Over 6 million Jews died. Untold millions of people die in the Second World War. The primary focus for the Allies, which the Allies for part of 1940 and most of 1941 consist only of England until the Soviet Union is brought into the war, is actually a strategy of Europe first. They're not too concerned about what Japan is doing. It's true that the British had a really difficult time trying to protect their colonies, especially in Burma, against the Japanese attack, and the British had experienced some pretty heavy defeats. But their primary focus is the strategy of defeating the Nazis first. And when the Japanese, against the advice of Hitler, their ally, decided to bomb the American naval base at Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, because the Japanese are concerned that the American naval base can interfere with their colonies and their attempts to resupply their armies there. America then is brought into the Second World War, much to Hitler's chagrin, because he was not ready for war with America. So now we have a very serious worldwide conflict that pulls pretty much everybody into it at some point or the other. It's, you know, a very long conflict. The Russians start to turn back the Germans in 1943. In 1942, the Allies, much to Stalin's irritation, decide that they want to fight the Nazis first in North Africa to protect their colonies there and their oil resources and so forth. So it's actually not until late 1944 with the D-Day invasion of Normandy of France that there is actually a second front opened up on the European continent. So up to that point, Stalin had pretty much been, fighting the Germans on his own and growing quite resentful about it too. So there is the seeds of the Cold War pretty much laid down right there. In that era, as we'll talk about. So in 1944, there is a constant push into Germany. By March 1945, the Russians were near Berlin. The Americans decided to hold back and let them enter Berlin first because they had fought for so long against the Nazis and suffered so much. In April of 1945, Hitler in his bunker kills himself and his mistress in a suicide pact, and a month later, the Nazis are out of the war. That, however, leaves the Asian campaigns against Japan. Stalin had liberated Eastern Europe from the Nazis. The Russians were the ones that liberated all the actual death camps in Poland and so forth. And what happens here is that at the end of the war, in the conferences in Tehran and Potsdam and so forth, the Western Allies solidify what the alliance with the Russians had been all along, purely a military alliance. Political questions were kept aside. Towards the end of the war, Stalin wants to keep hold of Eastern Europe. What happens is, as the Red Army liberates Poland and Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, so forth, these places are destroyed. The first thing the Nazis did when they came into town was to round up every politician, every communist, every newspaper editor, every writer, every literary person, every person that might be capable of mounting a resistance, and kill them. So there is no civic culture. There is no political parties in these conquered territories. The communists are it. And the communists often had been fighting in guerrilla wars against the Nazis, and communist leaders which had sought exile in the Soviet Union come back with the Red Army. So that means that they're the only game in town. The communist political functionaries are the only ones around that are still living. And you also have to understand that after 4 or 5 years under Nazi rule, a lot of people in Eastern Europe want the exact opposite of Nazism, communism, because they're so sickened by what the fascists did. Not all of them, of course, because there were collaborators with the Nazis in all these places. So what we see here is the gradual growth of communist movements in Eastern Europe, and they, unlike the Cold War discourse later where America believes that everybody in Eastern Europe is a victim of Stalin, well, quite a few of them wanted to go along. Of course, there was a breakdown in those relations later, but in this period, the Nazis, have done so much damage to these people that they want to, many of them want to go with communism. Not all, but many of them do. So the seeds of the Cold War are laid here already. And the question over whether the Soviets should enter the war, of course, they had to. They were required to by America when the Soviets officially became the Allies. But the new president, Harry Truman, in April 1945, he succeeded Roosevelt, who died. Truman decides he doesn't want the Soviets to establish a foothold in Asia. So he decides to change his strategy a bit, as we'll see in Part 2.